October 14, 1943, 24,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Major Egon Meyer watched the ungainly American fighter approaching his Focke-Wulf 190 with something between amusement and contempt. The P-47 Thunderbolt lumbered through the thin air like a pregnant whale, its massive radial engine cowling, giving it the appearance of a flying barrel. Through his canopy, Meyer could see the American pilot struggling to maintain altitude in the heavy machine, the distinctive white star on its fuselage marking it as easy prey. The Luftwaffe's leading expert on head-on attacks against bomber formations, credited with developing the devastating frontal assault tactics that had terrorized Allied bomber crews, Meyer waggled his wings mockingly at the American before rolling inverted to begin his attack run on the B-17 formation below. He had shot down 25 four-engine bombers using his perfected technique. This fat American fighter, which German pilots had been calling jugs with derision since their appearance over Europe 6 months earlier, wouldn't stop him from adding number 26. What Major Meyer didn't understand, what his decades of combat experience couldn't have prepared him for, was that the 8 Browning M2 machine guns hidden in those broad wings were about to deliver 13,600 foot-pounds of kinetic energy per second in a convergence pattern that would transform his Focke-Wulf into aluminum confetti. The American pilot, First Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, had been waiting for exactly this moment of German overconfidence. The transformation of aerial combat over Europe was about to be written in armor-piercing incendiary rounds traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The mathematics were terrifyingly simple. 8 guns, each firing at 800 rounds per minute, creating a combined rate of fire that delivered 106 half-inch projectiles per second into a target area roughly 6 feet in diameter at optimal convergence range. German fighters, designed to survive cannon hits from RAF Spitfires firing 20mm shells at 120 rounds per minute, were about to discover what synchronized American mass production could achieve when applied to the problem of aerial destruction. Egon Meyer wasn't just any German pilot. At 26 years old, he commanded Jagdgeschwader II Richthofen, the legendary fighter wing once led by the Red Baron himself. His Knight's Cross with oak leaves recognized 102 confirmed victories, making him one of barely 100 German pilots to achieve century status. More significantly, he had revolutionized bomber interception tactics with his frontal attack method, exploiting the B-17's initial weakness in forward firepower. His tactical innovations had been distributed throughout the Luftwaffe as official doctrine. Younger pilots studied his techniques with religious devotion. He was, by any measure, one of the most dangerous fighter pilots in the world. The morning of October 14th found him leading his Gruppe in defense of the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, targets so vital that their destruction could cripple German war production. The Americans had tried to hit these factories 2 months earlier, losing 60 bombers in what they called Black Thursday. Now they were back with 291 B-17s, and Meyer intended to make this Thursday even blacker. German radar had tracked the incoming formation from the moment it crossed the Dutch coast. Every available fighter from France to Bavaria was scrambling to intercept. The Luftwaffe would throw over 300 fighters at this raid, their largest defensive effort to date. But something had changed since August. The ungainly Thunderbolts that had seemed so laughable when they first appeared in April now carried auxiliary fuel tanks that extended their range deep into Germany. More disturbing, there were many more of them. Where once a dozen P-47s might escort the bombers to the German border before turning back, now 60 or more pressed on toward the target. Still, Meyer remained confident. His Focke-Wulf 190A-6 was a proven killer. Its BMW 801 engine producing 1,700 horsepower, its armament of 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns could destroy a bomber with a 2-second burst. Against the Thunderbolt, he expected even less difficulty. The American fighter's weaknesses were well documented in Luftwaffe intelligence reports. too heavy to climb effectively, unable to turn with German fighters, sluggish in acceleration. Its only advantages were diving speed and alleged durability, though Meyer dismissed the latter as American propaganda. No aircraft could be as tough as claimed in the increasingly wild combat reports. Tales of Thunderbolts returning with cylinder heads shot off, wings resembling Swiss cheese, control cables severed. These were obviously exaggerations to boost morale. As Meyer positioned for his attack on the bomber formation, he noticed the escorting Thunderbolts maintaining unusually tight formation above the B-17s. Previous encounters had shown American fighters eager to break formation and pursue individual combat, a tendency that made them easy targets for experienced German pilots. But these Thunderbolts stayed disciplined, weaving in a protective pattern that covered all angles of approach. Something in their tactical behavior had changed. The new American commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, had instituted rigid discipline and innovative tactics that maximized the P-47's strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. When Meyer rolled inverted and began his signature head-on attack dive toward the lead bomber box, he expected the escorting Thunderbolts to continue their predictable weaving pattern. Instead, 4 P-47s immediately rolled and followed him down, their massive weight advantage allowing them to accelerate faster than his Focke-Wulf could in a dive. This was impossible according to everything Meyer knew about energy management in aerial combat. No pilot would sacrifice altitude advantage so readily, yet here they came, and leading them was a Thunderbolt with half pint painted on its cowling, flown by Lieutenant Robert Johnson. Johnson had been studying German tactics for months, particularly Meyer's distinctive head-on attack pattern that had become legendary among bomber crews. He knew Meyer would approach from 12 o'clock high, diving through the formation at a specific angle, calculated to minimize exposure to defensive fire, while maximizing the vulnerability of the bomber's cockpit. Johnson had positioned himself precisely to intercept this attack vector. As Meyer committed to his dive, Johnson had him exactly where he wanted him, in a pursuit curve that would bring the German fighter into optimal convergence range of his 850s. The transformation of American fighter tactics had been systematic and deliberate. Where German pilots relied on individual skill honed through years of combat, American pilots applied industrial methodology to aerial warfare. They studied gun camera footage with scientific precision, calculated deflection angles with mechanical computing gun sights, and practiced standardized engagement patterns until they became automatic. Every P-47 pilot knew that his 8 guns converged at exactly 300 yards, that a 2-second burst delivered 212 rounds, that those rounds would cover a circular pattern 6 feet in diameter at convergence distance. They approached aerial combat not as a nightly duel but as a problem in applied ballistics. Meyer, focused on the bomber formation ahead, didn't initially recognize the threat developing behind him. His experience told him American pilots would break off rather than follow him through the bomber formation's defensive fire. But Johnson and his wingman, Lieutenant Walter Beckham, continued their pursuit, accepting the risk of friendly fire to get a shot at Germany's leading bomber killer. As Meyer lined up on the lead B-17 of the 385th Bomb Group, Johnson's computing gun sight placed its reticle on the Focke-Wulf. The range spinner showed 400 yards and closing. Johnson held his fire, waiting for the perfect moment. The mathematics of destruction were about to demonstrate themselves with terrible clarity. Each of Johnson's 8 Browning M2 machine guns fired the caliber .50 BMG cartridge, a round originally developed by John Browning during World War I, but perfected through American mass production techniques that achieved consistencies German ammunition factories couldn't match. The standard ball round weighed 709.5 grains and left the muzzle at 2,900 feet per second, delivering 4,200 foot-pounds of energy. But Johnson's guns were loaded with the devastating M8 armor-piercing incendiary round, which combined a hardened steel core with an incendiary compound that ignited upon impact. At 300 yards where Johnson would fire, These rounds retained 2,400 feet per second velocity and 3,800 foot-pounds of energy each. 8 guns firing simultaneously meant 30,400 foot-pounds of destructive energy arriving every second, with each armor-piercing core capable of penetrating 20 millimeters of face-hardened steel at that range. The incendiary compound would ignite fuel, oil, hydraulic fluid, and even aluminum structure under the right conditions. German fighters, armored to resist 7.92mm machine gun fire and 20mm cannon fragments, were not designed to withstand this level of concentrated kinetic assault. The moment of convergence arrived at 280 yards. Meyer, still focused on his bomber target, felt his aircraft shudder as the first round struck. His initial thought was that he'd been hit by defensive fire from the B-17s, but the violence of the impact exceeded anything bomber guns could deliver. The Focke-Wulf's tail section simply disappeared, transformed into metallic dust by the concentrated impact of dozens of armor-piercing rounds. The fuselage fuel tank, located directly behind the cockpit armor plate, took 17 hits in the first second. The incendiary compounds ignited the 115-octane C3 fuel with explosive force. The combustion accelerated by the oxygen-rich mixture at 24,000 feet altitude. Johnson held his trigger for exactly 2.5 seconds, his 8 guns delivering 265 rounds into Meyer's disintegrating fighter. The German ace's last coherent thought, recorded in a transmission intercepted by Allied intelligence, was disbelief. Impossible. The Jug cannot. The transmission ended as Meyer's aircraft transformed into what combat reports would describe as a rapidly expanding cloud of burning fragments. No parachute was observed. The Luftwaffe's tactical genius, the architect of the head-on attack that had terrorized bomber crews for months, had been reduced to atoms by American industrial logic, delivered at 800 rounds per minute per gun. The destruction of Egon Meyer sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe that went far beyond the loss of a talented pilot. Within hours, every German fighter unit on the Western Front knew that their leading ace had been killed, not in an elaborate dogfight showcasing superior skill, but simply erased by overwhelming firepower. The psychological impact was devastating. If Meyer, with all his experience and tactical brilliance, could be deleted so completely, what chance did average pilots have? This October 14th mission would become known as Second Schweinfurt, or Black Thursday revisited. The Americans lost 60 bombers and 5 fighters, including one P-47. The Germans lost 38 fighters confirmed destroyed and 20 more damaged beyond repair. But the real loss for the Luftwaffe was the shattering of their tactical superiority complex. The Thunderbolts hadn't just protected the bombers, they had hunted and destroyed German aces with mechanical efficiency. The killing of Egon Meyer was not a lucky shot, but a demonstration of systematic superiority in firepower that German aircraft simply weren't designed to counter. The evolution of the P-47 Thunderbolt from an object of ridicule to an instrument of terror had taken barely 6 months. When the first Thunderbolts arrived in England in January 1943, RAF pilots who saw them literally laughed. One British squadron leader famously remarked, "If you want to fly a barrel, at least make sure it's a beer barrel." The aircraft's dimensions defied every principle of fighter design that European air forces held sacred. Empty weight of 10,000 pounds when most fighters weighed 6,000, length of 36 feet when agility supposedly demanded compact dimensions, a propeller diameter of 12 feet, later increased to 13 feet with paddle blades, that looked like it had been stolen from a transport aircraft. The Republic Aviation Corporation, under the leadership of Alexander Kartveli, had approached fighter design from a uniquely American perspective. Instead of starting with aerodynamic ideals and trying to fit weapons and engines into them, they started with the weapons and engine, then built the minimum airplane around them. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine was a masterpiece of American engineering, an 18-cylinder radial that could produce 2,000 horsepower at sea level and maintain that power to altitudes where German engines gasped for air. The turbo supercharger system, with its complex ducting that gave the Thunderbolt its distinctive razorback profile, could maintain sea-level atmospheric pressure to the engine at 30,000 feet. But it was the armament that truly set the Thunderbolt apart. 8 Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 425 rounds per gun for a total of 3,400 rounds. The installation was a marvel of engineering that German designers studied with disbelief after capturing damaged specimens. Each gun was mounted in a heated compartment to prevent freezing at altitude. The ammunition feed system used electric boost motors to maintain consistent feeding even during high G maneuvers. The guns were harmonized so their fire converged at a point exactly 300 yards ahead of the aircraft, creating a cone of destruction that no fighter could survive. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gaby Gabreski, who would become America's top ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the weapon system's effect. "When you hit them with all 850s, they don't just go down, they come apart. I watched a 109 get hit with maybe a 1-second burst. The tail separated, both wings folded backward, the engine tore free from its mounts. The pilot never had a chance to bail out because there was no longer an airplane to bail out from." The German response to the Thunderbolt's firepower was to increase armor, but this only made their fighters heavier and less maneuverable while providing minimal additional protection. The standard 12mm armor plate behind a German pilot's seat could stop rifle-caliber rounds and shell fragments. Against the .50 BMG armor-piercing round, it might as well have been tissue paper. German engineers calculated that to protect against 850s, a fighter would need 25 millimeters of face-hardened steel armor weighing over 400 pounds. The weight penalty would make the aircraft unflyable. By November 1943, following Meyer's death and similar losses among experienced pilots, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine underwent emergency revision. New standing orders emphasized avoiding head-on engagements with Thunderbolts at all costs. The mathematics were inarguable. A Focke-Wulf 190 approaching a P-47 head-on faced 8 guns with a combined rate of 106 rounds per second, while the German could respond with 4 cannon firing a total of 11 rounds per second. Even if every German shell hit, the Americans' volume of fire would destroy the attacker before significant damage could be inflicted. The industrial foundation of the Thunderbolt's firepower superiority extended far beyond the aircraft itself. The ammunition production infrastructure was a testament to American mass production capabilities that Germany couldn't match even in peacetime. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri alone produced 30 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition monthly by 1943. Each round was manufactured to tolerances of plus or minus 0.001 inches, ensuring consistent ballistic performance that gunners could rely upon absolutely. The ammunition came in specialized variants that German intelligence found bewildering in their abundance. Standard ball, armor-piercing incendiary, armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, incendiary, and tracer. A typical P-47 combat load mixed these types in carefully calculated ratios. Every 5th round was a tracer to aid aiming, though American pilots found they rarely needed them given the volume of fire. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds were the real killers. Their tungsten carbide cores could penetrate any armor on German fighters, while the incendiary compound, containing barium nitrate and magnesium, burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. German pilots reported seeing aircraft literally catch fire from the inside out as incendiary rounds ignited fuel vapors in tanks thought to be empty. The psychological transformation among German pilots was documented in captured letters and interrogation reports. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, who survived the war with 33 victories, wrote in his diary after encountering Thunderbolts in September 1943, "The American fighters have changed everything. We called them furniture vans when they first appeared, these massive, ugly machines that seemed to violate every principle of fighter design. Now we call them meat grinders. When those 8 guns open fire, it sounds like fabric tearing, but amplified 1,000 times. The ammunition is endless. They fire bursts of 5, 6, 7 seconds. We have enough cannon ammunition for perhaps 10 seconds total. They seem to have enough for eternity. The production statistics behind the Thunderbolt force were staggering even by American standards. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant on Long Island was producing 300 P-47s monthly by October 1943. The Evansville, Indiana plant, built from scratch in a cornfield, added another 200 monthly. Each Thunderbolt required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with a defect rate below 0.5%. Supporting this production was an ammunition manufacturing system that defied German comprehension. While Germany struggled to produce enough 20mm cannon shells for their fighters, often limiting pilots to 120 rounds per gun, America was manufacturing .50 caliber ammunition at rates that seemed physically impossible. The monthly production of 30 million rounds at Lake City was supplemented by plants in Denver, Des Moines, and St. Louis. By late 1943, America was producing more .50 caliber ammunition monthly than Germany produced all small arms ammunition combined. The day after Egon Meyer's death, October 15, 1943, General Adolf Galland convened an emergency meeting of fighter commanders at Luftwaffe headquarters. The agenda was simple: how to counter the Thunderbolt threat. The proposals revealed German desperation: develop new head-on attack angles to minimize exposure, concentrate attacks on Thunderbolts that had dropped their external tanks, focus on forcing them into turning fights where German fighters held advantage, increase armor plating on critical components. Every proposal was problematic, revealing fundamental misunderstanding of the threat they faced. Major Georg Peter Eder, who would survive the war with 78 victories, provided the most honest assessment. We're trying to fight American industrial production with German tactical skill. Every Thunderbolt we shoot down is replaced within days. Every pilot they lose has been trained for 400 hours. We're sending boys up with 50 hours. Their ammunition supply is infinite. Ours is rationed. Their guns don't jam from cold or overheating. Ours fail constantly. We need to accept reality. We're not fighting the same war. The impact on German morale was catastrophic. Young pilots who had joined the Luftwaffe, inspired by aces like Meyer, now faced the reality that skill and courage meant nothing against 8 synchronized machine guns. Letters home, censored but revealing, showed the transformation. "We don't dogfight anymore," wrote Unteroffizier Klaus Weber. "We make one pass if we can and run. The Americans have turned air combat into an industrial process. They don't need to be good. They just need to put enough lead in the air." By December 1943, the Thunderbolt had transformed from a tactical problem to a strategic crisis for the Luftwaffe. The loss rate among German fighters engaging P-47s had reached 23%, unsustainable by any measure. More critically, the loss rate among experienced pilots was even higher, as they were more likely to press attacks against the heavily armed Americans. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experience faster than it could train replacements, and every replacement faced American pilots who had trained for twice as long on aircraft with 8 times the firepower. The technical evolution of the Thunderbolt continued throughout this period. The P-47D-15, introduced in late 1943, featured a Hamilton standard paddle blade propeller that improved climb rate by 500 feet per minute. The P-47D-25 added a bubble canopy for better visibility. The P-47M could reach 470 miles per hour. But these improvements were almost unnecessary. The basic design with its 850s had already achieved tactical superiority through firepower alone. German pilots didn't fear the Thunderbolt because it could outfly them. They feared it because it could delete them. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who had killed Egon Meyer, would finish the war with 27 victories, making him one of America's top aces. His combat reports, studied after the war, showed remarkable consistency. Average engagement range, 250 yards. Average burst length, 2.3 seconds. Average rounds fired per kill, 247. The mechanical precision was intentional. American pilots were taught to fight by the numbers, to trust their equipment absolutely, to let industrial superiority do the work. Johnson later wrote, "I didn't need to be a better pilot than the Germans. I just needed to put my gun sight on them for 2 seconds." The desperation of German responses to the Thunderbolt threat reached absurd levels by early 1944. The Sturmgruppe concept equipped Focke-Wulf 190s with additional armor plating, increasing weight by 400 pounds, to survive long enough to ram American bombers. The theory was that pilots could survive Thunderbolt attacks long enough to reach the bombers. In practice, the added weight made them such easy targets that entire Sturmgruppen were annihilated without reaching their objectives. The 850s simply pounded through the extra armor, taking perhaps 3 seconds to kill instead of 2. The testimony of German pilots who survived encounters with Thunderbolts provided consistent themes. The sound was universally described as terrifying, a ripping noise that started as a buzz and escalated to a roar as rounds struck home. The visual effect was overwhelming, with tracers creating what looked like laser beams of destruction. The physical impact was catastrophic, with aircraft not just damaged, but disintegrated. Oberleutnant Walter Hagenaar described watching his wingman hit by Thunderbolt fire. The airplane didn't fall. It ceased. One moment it was there, the next it was confetti. I found pieces of Wolfgang's Messerschmitt scattered over 5 square kilometers. The psychological warfare aspect of the Thunderbolt's firepower cannot be overstated. German pilots developed what medical officers classified as Jabo-Angst, or fighter-bomber fear, physical symptoms of anxiety that appeared when Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without concern became physically ill before missions against Thunderbolts. The distinctive sound of the Pratt & Whitney engine, a deep thundering roar that gave the aircraft its name, caused panic in German pilots who heard it. Many simply dove for cloud cover rather than engage. As 1944 progressed, the Thunderbolt's role evolved from bomber escort to active hunter. The introduction of paddle blade propellers improved climb performance enough that P-47s could pursue German fighters trying to escape. The standard tactic became Zemke's fan, named after Colonel Hub Zemke, where Thunderbolts would spread out in a line abreast formation 60 miles wide, sweeping across Germany like a scythe. Anything that flew in front of this formation died. The 850s didn't require precise aiming or complex deflection shooting. They simply filled the air with so much lead that survival became statistically impossible. The production miracle that enabled this tactical dominance continued to accelerate. By mid-1944, Republic Aviation was completing 1 Thunderbolt every 41 minutes around the clock. The Farmingdale plant employed 24,000 workers in 3 shifts. The Evansville facility added another 15,000. These workers, mostly women and minorities who would have been excluded from such work before the war, achieved quality standards that exceeded peacetime requirements. Each gun installation was test-fired before delivery, requiring 3,400 rounds just for pre-delivery testing. The German aircraft industry, by contrast, was collapsing into chaos. Dispersed production in underground facilities to avoid bombing meant quality control disappeared. Slave labor, increasingly relied upon, actively sabotaged components. The few fighters that reached combat units often had defective weapons, engines that failed after hours, and electrical systems that shorted in clouds. Even when German pilots had the skill and courage to engage, their equipment betrayed them. Guns jammed from poor ammunition quality, engines failed from contaminated fuel, radios died from moisture infiltration. The story of Luftwaffe disintegration was written in the testimony of surviving pilots. Major Günther Rall, one of history's highest-scoring aces with 275 victories, encountered Thunderbolts in early 1944. "We had been fighting for 5 years. We knew every trick, every tactic. But the Americans had made skill irrelevant. They put 8 heavy machine guns on a flying locomotive and sent hundreds of them. Each one could destroy any of our fighters in seconds. It wasn't combat anymore, it was industrial execution." The final insult to German fighter doctrine came with the discovery that many Thunderbolt pilots were barely out of flight school. Americans with 50 hours in type were shooting down German veterans with 500 combat hours. The skill differential that should have guaranteed German success was simply overwhelmed by firepower differential. A novice who could hold his gun sight on target for 2 seconds was more dangerous than an ace trying to line up a deflection shot with limited cannon ammunition. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe instituted new rules of engagement that essentially admitted defeat. Pilots were ordered to avoid combat with Thunderbolts unless possessing both numerical and altitude advantage. Even then, only one firing pass was permitted before breaking off. These orders, from an air force that had once ruled European skies, represented complete capitulation to American industrial logic. The Knights of the Air had been replaced by flying artillery, and the Knights had lost. The mathematics of the Thunderbolt's firepower superiority were studied exhaustively after the war. Each .50 caliber round carried approximately 3,800 foot-pounds of energy at typical combat ranges. 8 guns firing simultaneously delivered 30,400 foot-pounds per second. A 2-second burst, the American standard, meant 60,800 foot-pounds of cumulative kinetic impact. For comparison, a direct hit from an 88mm anti-aircraft shell delivered approximately 50,000 foot-pounds. The Thunderbolt could deliver more destructive energy than artillery, and do it repeatedly, accurately, at 25,000 feet altitude. The transformation of aerial warfare that the Thunderbolt represented went beyond simple firepower. It demonstrated that industrial warfare rewarded standardization over customization, volume over precision, and mechanical reliability over human skill. German aircraft, often hand-fitted with careful attention to detail, were masterpieces of engineering. But they required skilled pilots to exploit their capabilities and careful maintenance to keep flying. Thunderbolts were industrial products, identical, reliable, and operable by average pilots with average skills. The story of Egon Meyer's death became legendary within the Luftwaffe, told and retold with increasingly mythic overtones. In some versions, he fought gallantly against overwhelming odds. In others, he was ambushed by cowardly Americans who wouldn't face him in fair combat. The reality that he was simply erased by superior firepower while focused on his attack run was too demoralizing to acknowledge. The Luftwaffe needed heroes, not victims of industrial mathematics. But the truth was inescapable. Their greatest tactical innovator had been deleted by American mass production. As the war progressed through 1944, the Thunderbolt's 850s became the soundtrack of German defeat. The distinctive hammering sound, like a giant sewing machine run by a madman, preceded the destruction of bridges, locomotives, truck convoys, and anything else that moved in daylight. German soldiers reported that the sound alone caused panic, sending entire units diving for cover before the first round struck. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. German civilians, told for years about Aryan superiority and American weakness, watched their defenders flee from American fighters that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and no fear. The production statistics by war's end told the complete story of American industrial triumph. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter. These aircraft fired approximately 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition in combat. They destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in aerial combat and 3,315 on the ground. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 60,000 rockets. But their most decisive contribution was the destruction of German pilot confidence. The Luftwaffe never recovered from learning that courage and skill meant nothing against 8 synchronized Browning machine guns. The post-war analysis by German commanders was unanimous in its conclusion. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland summarized, "The P-47's 8 machine guns represented a revolution we didn't understand until too late. We thought in terms of precise shooting with limited ammunition. The Americans thought in terms of probability clouds and sustained fire. We built fighters for artists. They built fighters for workers. Their workers won." The last documented combat between a Thunderbolt and German fighter occurred on May 7, 1945, one day before Germany's surrender. Lieutenant James Butler of the 56th Fighter Group encountered a Messerschmitt Bf 109K4 over Czechoslovakia. The German pilot, his identity lost to history, attempted the kind of turning fight that might have worked against any other opponent. Butler simply flew straight, waited until the Messerschmitt crossed his nose and fired a 3-second burst. The German fighter, one of the most advanced piston engine fighters ever built, disintegrated like every other victim of the 80s. It was a fitting end to the transformation of air combat from nightly dueling to industrial deletion. Today, when historians analyze the decisive factors in the Allied air victory over Germany, the P-47 Thunderbolt's 8-gun armament stands as a watershed moment in military technology. It proved that overwhelming firepower could negate tactical skill, that industrial quantity could defeat individual quality, and that mass production could triumph over craftsmanship. The German pilots who had mocked the ungainly American fighters as jugs and furniture vans learned that in industrial warfare, the side with the most guns firing the most bullets, the fastest wins. The legacy of Egon Meyer's death extends beyond one pilot's fate. His destruction while executing a tactically perfect attack approach demonstrated that the era of the individual ace was ending. Future aerial combat would belong to whoever could put the most weapons on target fastest, a principle that extends from the Thunderbolt's 850s through modern fighter aircraft carrying dozens of missiles. Meyer had taunted the Thunderbolt, seeing it as a fat, slow target. 2.5 seconds later, he had been converted from Germany's leading tactical innovator into a rapidly expanding cloud of aluminum fragments and burning fuel. The Nazi ace had learned in the last seconds of his life what 265 armor-piercing incendiary rounds could do to a Focke-Wulf 190. His final radio transmission, "Impossible, the Jug cannot," stands as an epitaph for the Luftwaffe's failure to comprehend American industrial warfare. The Thunderbolt could, and did, delete German fighters with mechanical efficiency that turned aerial combat from an art into an industrial process. The 850s didn't care about the Knight's Cross at Meyer's throat or his 100 victories or his tactical innovations. They simply transformed him into history, one round at a time, at 2,900 feet per second. The story of the Thunderbolt's 8 guns is ultimately the story of American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Take a simple, reliable mechanism, the Browning M2 machine gun, manufacture it in unlimited quantities to exacting standards. Install 8 of them in a flying tank powered by an engine that could run forever. Train average young Americans to fly it with basic competence. Then build thousands of these aircraft and send them to destroy an enemy that still believed wars were won by individual excellence rather than industrial arithmetic. The German pilots who taunted the Thunderbolt in 1943 weren't laughing by 1944. They were running, diving for clouds, or dying in the convergence zone of 8 synchronized 50s that turned the skies over Europe into an American shooting gallery. The mathematics were inexorable. 8 guns times 800 rounds per minute times 425 rounds per gun equals German defeat. Egon Meyer had been one of the variables in that equation, eliminated with the same mechanical precision that American factories used to stamp out ammunition by the billions. His death proved that in the age of industrial warfare, The pilot who taunts a Thunderbolt receives 106 rounds per second as a response. The 850s didn't argue. They simply deleted their targets from existence and moved on to the next German fighter, foolish enough to challenge American mass production, made manifest in wings, guns, and inexhaustible ammunition.